In 1680, the Pueblo Indians living in the Spanish colony of New Mexico revolted. They forced the Spanish out of the region, took control of an enormous number of Spanish horses, and began a lucrative horse trade. The trade in horses moved north from New Mexico, following well-worn indigenous trading routes that moved along the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains, at the point where the mountain region gradually melted into the Great Plains. Because horses were not found in the Americas before European contact, the indigenous peoples living in the middle of what would later become the United States had not yet encountered the animals. The introduction of horses was a revolutionary moment. Tribes who gained access to horses gained immediate and profound advantages in their ability to travel great distances, engage in more extensive trade, hunt, and wage war. Within a decade, this indigenous horse trade reached the Shoshone peoples living where the Great Plains sweep through modern-day Wyoming and Montana. Bison hunting was at the center of Shoshone life, and horses made the hunt far easier. However, trading in goods that came from Spanish territories also exposed the Shoshone to diseases that were widespread across the massive interconnected landmasses of Africa, Europe, and Asia, but that had never existed before in the Americas, and which Native Americans thus had no immunities to. As the Shoshones fell prey to the kind of contact-induced epidemics that killed millions of Native Americans, a large group splintered off and headed south along the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains, following the flow of horses to its source in New Mexico. This group was probably seeking to escape the epidemic, but it also appears they were seeking to establish themselves within the horse trade that had such clear potential to revolutionize indigenous America. As they approached the source of horses in New Mexico, they formed an alliance with the Utes, after which Utah is named. The Utes had long raided horses from the Spanish, who had recently reconquered New Mexico, and they shared their expertise in how to use them in war, hunting, trade, and travel. Over the next generation, the two allied tribes raided so many horses from the Spanish in New Mexico that the settlers no longer had enough horses to mount a defense. The Spanish were soon cursing the new group from the north as Camanches, the Ute word for enemy. Newly rich in horses and knowledge of the Spanish borderlands, the Comanches headed east onto the Great Plains of the Southwest, where immense horse herds could be sustained on the seemingly infinite grasslands. Once on the plains, the Comanche herds grew rapidly. Their horses allowed them to hunt bison with great effectiveness, and the Comanche soon realized that if they focused all their energies on hunting bison and expanding their herds, that they could dominate the regional trade in horses, bison hides, and bison meat. Knowing that they could trade these goods for all the food they needed, the Comanche turned away from farming and foraging in order to focus exclusively on horses and bison. In their effort to monopolize the horse and bison trade and eliminate trade competition, especially for the food sources they relied on, the Comanches went to war against their main competitor on the southern plains, the Apache. The Apache had thrived on the plains as farmers, but once they were at war, those farms became a military liability. Whereas the nomadic Camanche had no farms or villages to attack, the Apache had to defend the places where they were rooted and which they counted on for food and shelter. By sweeping into Apache villages in the dark of night, destroying their food storages, killing their livestock, burning their homes, and quickly disappearing into the night, the Comanche wore down their competitors on the plains. They combined this type of swift guerrilla-style attack with massive frontal assaults that focused on killing as many Apache men and enslaving as many women and children as possible. Following a practice that was widespread amongst indigenous peoples in the region, some of these slaves were sold on the New Mexican slave markets, while others were adopted or married into families and eventually became Comanches themselves. By 1740, the Apache had been forced out of the plains regions of modern-day New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Some fled further south onto the plains of Spanish Texas, while others moved to the Rio Grande area and the contemporary US-Mexican border region. In return, the Comanches received manufactured French products, including iron axes, metal-tipped arrows and lances, and most importantly guns that were superior to anything made by the Spanish. The Comanche then used this superior firepower to raid Spanish-controlled New Mexico for horses, which they then sold to the French, who then gave them more weapons. By 1750, this cycle had created busy commercial routes connecting Camanche and French Louisiana. The Comanche population had grown to 15,000, and it was rapidly increasing. The main driver of their population boom was an abundant food supply, based on the Comanche's ability to trade cherished horses and bison robes for plentiful and diverse foods. Their horse herds were probably upwards of 30,000, and that was rapidly expanding as well. By this time, Comanches had broken up into dozens of bands consisting of large extended families, so that their horses would have enough space to graze and find water. This rapid population growth, combined with a desire to acquire new markets, created pressures to expand into new territories. The Comanche bands to the south pushed into the vast plains of Spanish Texas, where 1 million wild horses roamed, and just as importantly, where isolated and vulnerable Spanish missions and presidios held abundant supplies of tamed horses ready for the taking. Because training wild horses was a high-skill task requiring weeks of labor, in their efforts to monopolize the region's horse trade, Comanches sought out vulnerable and abundant supplies of domesticated horses that could immediately be traded. Over the following century, this would lead Comanches to constantly push into new raiding domains. When the Comanche arrived on the southern plains of Spanish Texas, they encountered their old Apache competitors who they had forced south. Once again, they set themselves to forcing the Apache out of the region. This time, however, the Apaches were allied with the Spanish. The Comanche responded by forming an alliance of their own with the smaller indigenous groups of the region, who felt marginalized by the Apache-Spanish alliance. The Comanche-led alliance, which the Spanish referred to as the Norteños, attacked Spanish missions and presidios with indigenous armies that were up to 2,000 warriors strong and armed with French guns. Reinforcement armies sent from Mexico City were defeated by well-armed Comanche warriors, who were by this time some of the best horseback riders on the continent. They were faster than the Spanish, could fight better on horseback than the Spanish, and used guerrilla warfare tactics that the Spanish were unable to adjust to. The Comanche forced the Spanish to realize that they were not the strongest power in Texas. In an attempt to appease the Comanche, the Spanish severed their alliance with the Apache, who fled to the region of the current US-Mexico border. Now completely forced out of the plains and alienated from the Spanish, the Apache initiated decades of systematic raids on the Spanish settlements of what is today northern Mexico. In 1763, however, the Spanish saw their luck turn around, or so they thought. In that year, the French were forced to turn over the Louisiana territory to Spain after suffering defeats in the 7 Years' War. With the French gone, Spain assumed the Comanches would lose their access to guns, gunpowder, and ammunition. They assumed that Comanches would be forced to turn to the Spanish for European manufactured goods, and would be forced to cease their raiding in order to build better trade relations with Spanish territories, in order to gain access to those goods. The Spanish further assumed that once the Comanches ceased their raids, that they would be able to strengthen their colonies in New Mexico, Texas, and Spanish Louisiana, thus hemming the Comanche into the west, south, and east. The Comanche, however, had other ideas. By this time, they had dominated the entire portion of the Great Plains that was suitable for breeding and racing horses. On the northern plains, the winter were too cold for baby horses to survive, which made breeding impossible. Even on the central plains just north of Camancheria, winter blizzards could sometimes freeze entire herds. The Comanches understood that their northern neighbors required an endless stream of new horses if they wished to survive economically and militarily, and Comanches set out to supply them. By providing horses to the indigenous peoples of the northern plains who traded with British Canada, the Comanche also secured access to British markets and British guns. Meanwhile, Spain found itself unable to control the borders of Spanish Louisiana, and French and British smugglers with an interest in weakening Spain pushed into the prime trading region of the lower Mississippi. The Comanche were soon receiving mass amounts of guns from the north as well as the east. One record reveals 17 horseloads of guns during a single trade deal. Whereas the Spanish had hoped to hem the Comanches in on 3 sides and cut off their access to guns in 1763, in 1767, a Spanish report warned that the Comanches were better armed than Spanish troops. By the 1770s, the Comanches were selling coveted British and French manufactured goods at the trade fairs in New Mexico. Instead of the Comanches turning to the Spanish for manufactured goods, Spanish settlers now turned to the Camanche. However, such trade was not the Comanche's top priority. That was providing horses to the Plain Indians, the French, and the British. And the New Mexicans had plenty of horses. Having freed themselves from any dependence on the Spanish markets of New Mexico, Comanches now sought to bend the Spanish colony to their own purposes. Over the course of the 1770s, Comanches launched over 100 raids into New Mexico, stealing thousands of horses and trading them to the French, British, and the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. Comanche raiding parties also sought to systematically weaken the Spanish colony by destroying ranches, farms, food storages, irrigation systems, and slaughtering entire herds of livestock. Their destruction was strategic. By depriving New Mexico of resources, food, and its ability to be productive, the Comanche made New Mexicans dependent on Comanche trade, even as Comanches assaulted them. At the same time, they always made sure to leave ranches and farms with just enough resources to replenish their horse herds, so that they could be raided again in the future. Comanches also murdered hundreds of fighting-age New Mexican men during their raids, and enslaved New Mexican women and children, some of whom were sold throughout the Comanche's extensive trade network, and some of whom were used as a source of labor within Comancheria, to tend the ever-expanding herds of horses and to tend the endless bison heights. Entire communities fled in fear, and New Mexican settlements vanished from the map. By 1780, only the capital of Santa Fe remained untouched, but the city was overflowing with refugees. The governor's palace had strings of dried Indian ears hanging above its portal, to signify Spanish dominance over the region's indigenous people. But indigenous peoples who had once feared the Spanish now gravitated towards Comanche alliances and markets, and spoke more of the Comanche language than Spanish. Spanish officials had planned for the colony of New Mexico to ship surplus goods south into Mexico. Instead, those goods headed east into Comancheria. New Mexico now had become a Spanish colony in name only. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to be notified about our latest videos.